Hi and welcome to this video. I'm going to show you how you can use flows to create a work item in Azure DevOps when a vulnerability is created in AttackForge. Flows is a new module in AttackForge which is purpose-built for automations and integrations. The example in this video is going to be included on our support site, so you can follow along here as well. Separately, if you head over to GitHub repository for flows, you'll find that there's an example flow for Azure DevOps which has been uploaded, and you can download this flow and import it into your own AttackForge. That's going to help to get you up and running much faster, and you can always adjust the flow to your own needs. So let's start by checking out this flow in action. So we're going to come to our project in AttackForge, and we're going to go ahead and create a vulnerability. We're going to search for the vulnerability that we found. In this case, it's a reflected cross-site scripting. And now we're going to go ahead and assign the affected assets. And let's go ahead and save this vulnerability. Now we'll give it a moment for the flow to run. So we'll refresh the page, and we'll see that the vulnerability is now exported to Azure DevOps, and we can see the ID that's come back for the work item that was created. Now, if we open up ADO and click on work items, we should see that vulnerability is now registered as a work item. And if we click on that, we'll see all of that information that has come across from AttackForge. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper to see how this flow is working. So back in AttackForge, from the main menu, there's an option there for the flows module. It will appear under integrations if you have access to it. And from here, we can see I have a flow set up to create an ADO work item. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And we'll see that there was a run of this flow that just completed moments ago. So let's go ahead and open that. Now this is the flow that executed when we created that vulnerability. And we'll see that this flow is comprised of two actions. The first action is to create the work item inside Azure DevOps. And the second is to take the work item ID and store that on the vulnerability in AttackForge. So we can see the input and output into the first action, and the input was the vulnerability data itself. So this is coming from the vulnerability created event. So we have all of that key information about the vulnerability that's already at our disposal. And using all of this information, we've now sent a request to Jira, and if we open up the HTTP tab, we'll see the URL that we sent that information to. And separately, we can see that it was a post request, and the Azure DevOps server had come back with a 200 response, which is generally a good sign. We can see the request body that we sent to ADO, so we can see exactly what our payload looked like, and separately the headers that were sent to ADO as well. And also we can see what the Azure DevOps server responded with in terms of its response headers and also its response body. And what we're particularly interested in here is the ID showing that this work item's been registered, and it's returned its ID that we can use. We can also click on logs to see more information as well about what's happening in every step of the action itself. So let's open up this flow to see how it's working. So we're going to click on edit, and the first thing you'll notice is that this is configured to run on a vulnerability created event. Now this is useful if we want to immediately create work items as vulnerabilities get created. However, in your use case, you may prefer to only create work items when vulnerabilities have gone through a QA process, or potentially at the end of the project, you might want to create your work items at that point in time. So that's where you can rely on different types of events. So for example, a vulnerability updated event, and then apply your own logic to handle your use case. Or it could be even a project updated event as well. But in this example, we can see that when the vulnerability is created, we're going to go ahead and create the ADO work item straight away. And here we can see that it's a post request and it's going to this particular URL. So how did we know where to send that data to? We can see in Microsoft's Azure DevOps REST API documentation, if you search and find work items and click on create, you'll have some information here that's going to help you with building your flow based on what Microsoft's expecting. So here we can see some information indicating that it needs to be a post request and what the URL needs to point to, and particularly the dynamic components being the organization and the project. Because we know that information in AttackForge, we can go ahead and set that right away. We can also see that in the examples what a successful request body should look like, and also what a successful response should look like as well. So this is going to be very useful in constructing our request and also handling the response back from ADO. So let's come back and have a look at this action in a bit more detail. So here we can see that we have some headers that we're going to be setting, and this the content type is configured to be application JSON patch plus JSON. So if you set application JSON, then the ADO API will not accept it. So just make sure that you set exactly what is specified in the documentation. But also we're applying an authorization header that has the credentials so we can authenticate against the API. We're using a secret, so AttackForge does support secrets within the flows. So here we've created two separate secrets. One has our credentials for the Azure DevOps API, and the other is our AttackForge self-service API, which token, which we're going to use to update the vulnerability once we've created the ADO work item. So let's jump into the request script and see how we're constructing that body of the request that's going to be sent to Azure DevOps. So the first thing you'll notice here on the right hand side is that there's some example information about a vulnerability created event, and in this case it's vulnerability data. So we have all of that information that belongs to the vulnerability, as well as ability to access information about the assets, the write-ups, the project, and other sorts of information as well. So in our case, we have all the data we need already within this event payload. However, if there's other data that you might want for creating your work item, you can always have a step in your flow to query the AttackForge API to retrieve additional data or any other external systems that you might need. But here we're going to proceed with now building up a request that's going to be sent to the ADO API. We're going to start with extracting the AttackForge project ID. Now, because vulnerabilities can belong to many projects, we can go through and extract that information and then set that in our variable there. And as part of the return statement, there's a few components that we want to return. The first thing is we want to include that project ID that we just found. We're going to need that in the next action to update the vulnerability in AttackForge with the ADO work item ID. Separately, we're also going to need the AttackForge vulnerability ID as well. Here we can see that for the request itself, the body of the request is going to be built using this function. And let's dive into that function and see how it's working. So if we look at the documentation on the ADO site, here we'll see that it's expecting an array. So here we can see that there's an array of object fields, and each of these are referring to a particular field in itself. So this is an example saying this is going to be the title field and what the value of the title for the work item should be. So coming back to our script, we can see that we're setting this array, we're calling it fields, and we're going in taking the vulnerability title from AttackForge, and we're pushing that object with that information into that array. So here we can see that we now have the first field, which is going to cover the title of the work item. Now, as part of the next step, we can see we're taking the priorities from AttackForge and we're mapping them to what the ADO project is expecting. Now, as part of their API, it's set up to take numbers. So we're mapping with 1 being the most critical. So we're mapping from AttackForge's priorities critical to 1 and so forth from that point as well. Now your ADO project may have a different configuration. So again, it's worth checking that as ahead of time before you start building your flow. But we can see that now that we've set that priority, we're going to again push that field into that array. Separately, we're going to start building out a description. Now, you'll notice that the API does support some limited HTML tags. So for example, I'm including a heading 1 and heading 2. So visually, when we look at the work item, it breaks up a lot of the information to make it easier for the people to process this information. So here we can see we're building up the description field. So all of this information's within the description of the work item. So this is really all of the vulnerability data that we want to make the teams aware of. So we can add the CVSS scores if that's something that's important for you. And we can go ahead and add that information as well. Here we can see we're using tables. And there is some, again, limited CSS that is supported. So we're doing some text alignment just again to make things look a bit neater. Separately, we can see we're also adding the recommendations. If there's any notes, we're going ahead and assigning the notes as well. And we're also adding the POC and any tags there as well. Once we finish with the description, we'll go ahead and push that field into that array. And now we have all of the fields that we want to send to ADO. So let's take a look at what the response script looks like. Now the response script is going to run when the ADO API server returns a response back from the request that we sent. The response itself in the flow can be will include the status code. So this is the HTTP status code, the headers, as well as the body. So the first thing we want to do is just do some error handling and just make sure that the information has come back in the required format so we can try and read and see whether there's an ID that's come back for the work item. So we're checking the content type, making sure that it is JSON format. And at that point, we can then check whether there's an ID that's come back. And again, we're expecting that because we can see that a successful request to the create work item API endpoint should return an ID within the JSON body. So here we can check that just if it doesn't exist, log an error. So here we're taking advantage of AF script to do some error logging, and that's going to help as well. Now, if this is the first time that you're building a flow, I highly recommend to jump on our support site and just read a little bit more about AF Script, just to understand again how it works and what's supported. And separately the logging, which is going to be very useful in all different circumstances for troubleshooting and even just reporting on how your flows are working in the real world. So if everything is successful, we should get back now the ADO work item ID. So we can go ahead and retrieve that from the body of the response. And we can also continue to pass on the AttackForge project ID and vulnerability ID. This information had already been passed across to the response script from the request script. So again, we're just passing this on into the next action. So this output is going to be used as input into the next action. So let's go ahead and take a look at that action itself. So this one is an update request on the AttackForge API. So if we jump back into AttackForge, firstly, I should mention that this ADO work item ID that we're going to be updating, that is configured as a custom field on my vulnerability. Now, if I open up the administration and click on vulnerabilities, here we can see that I've created a section for integrations as part of my vulnerability fields. And we have a field here created called ADO work item ID. So this is the field that we're going to use to update with the work item ID that's going to be returned from that first action. And the particular key we want to use is this value. So coming back into our flow, we can see that we're going to be making a put request, and we can see that the URL is going to be specified in the script. So here we can put anything because it's really just a reminder at this point for anyone working on this flow that we're going to be dynamically setting the URL within the request script itself. So that's different from what we did in the first action where we knew what the URL was. In this case, we're going to set it dynamically. And this is useful when you have URLs that might be dynamic dependent on what your flow is doing. So how we know that is, again, if we come into the AttackForge self-service API documentation, search for update vulnerability, and here we'll see all of the information that's needed to update the vulnerability in AttackForge. And we'll notice that it does require having the ID within the URL. Now, AttackForge does expect the data to be in JSON format, so we can go ahead and set the content type header. And separately, we can also set the AttackForge self-service API key as well. Now, again, we're using a secret for that, so you can go ahead and enter your AttackForge self-service API key as a secret and then reference it as part of these headers. So let's take a look at the request script. So what we'll notice here, it's doing some checks initially to make sure that we have the ADO work item ID. Now this is again data that has come from that first action. So if that action had run successfully, we should have already created a work item, and now we're leveraging that work item ID as well as the vulnerability ID from AttackForge and the project ID to then go in and tell AttackForge what that work item ID is. Here we can see how we're constructing that URL. So we're taking the component of the URL that we know, and then we're adding the vulnerability ID to the end of that. And then that will match the documentation, so we know that's going to be valid. And the body expects the project ID to be there as well, so we know which vulnerability on which project we're updating. And separately, the fields that we're going to be updating. In this case, it's just a single custom field, which is the ADO work item ID. So we're going to go ahead and take that information and take that ID and pass it into the value. The reason we're stringifying it here is because the data does come back in as a number. So we can see here that it is in a number format, and because we've set that field up as an input field, it's expecting a string. So for that reason, we have configured where we're doing a JSON.stringify function to convert it into a string. Let's take a look at the response script. Now, if the response comes back and it's successful, what we are expecting is the result from that API to tell us that the vulnerability has been updated. And if that is the case, then in this instance, we can go ahead and finish up the flow. And that's what we can see in this step here. In the scenario where there might be some errors, we're handling all of that at this point as well. So again, checking that the content type of the response headers is JSON format. That allows us to then know that we can read the body coming back, but also making sure that the right status code is there. And again, taking advantage of AF-Script's logging capabilities to then have that extra logging information in case there's any issues. So you can always see that in the history of each run of your flow. So that's really all there is to it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.